Hey everyone, this is Daniel from What Plays, and today we're going to take an in-depth look at the AYANEO Pocket DS. This is a high-end, dual-screen, clamshell Android gaming and emulation handheld that feels premium and is mostly a joy to use. AYANEO claims that the Pocket DS is the first dual-screen Android handheld in the world. However, the AYN Thor, which I just reviewed on the channel, was the first dual-screen handheld to actually ship to customers. The Pocket DS is the little brother to the AYANEO Flip 1 SDS, which is their Windows-based dual-screen clamshell handheld, and I covered this device extensively in my review, which I'll leave linked below along with my AYN Thor review. I fully intend on doing a comparison video with the AYANEO Pocket DS and the AYN Thor, but for today I'll be reviewing the Pocket DS on its own and comparing it to the Windows version, as there are some notable differences, most of which I like but also some I don't. My voice might sound a little different today. I'm still recovering from being sick, but I didn't want to delay this video any more than I already have, so let's go ahead and get started. The AYANEO Pocket DS is powered by the Snapdragon G3x Gen 2, which is essentially an overclocked gaming-focused 8 Gen 2 and has a performance scope of 15 watts TDP. This chip has been used in several AYANEO devices such as the Pocket Ace, Pocket S, Pocket DMG, and Pocket Evo. In general, emulation support is excellent, and the chip also supports third-party turnip drivers, which improve performance in several emulators. The Pocket DS comes in several flavors, each with different RAM, storage, and color configurations. The black models come with 8, 12, or 16 gigabytes of RAM and 128, 256, and 512 gigabytes of storage, respectively. There is a yellow color which the community has lovingly dubbed as Dragon Cheese, although I do wonder which part of the dragon the cheese is coming from, and a retro gray color. Both of these non-black colors only come in the highest tier, which has 16 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage. The base model with 128 gigabytes of storage uses UFS 3.1, while all other models use UFS 4.0. I would say that it's worth it to upgrade to the middle tier, since UFS 4.0 is about double the read and write performance of 3.1, and 12 gigabytes of RAM will give you more headroom for higher-end emulators like Switch and Windows emulation. All models use LPDDR5X RAM clocked at 8533 MHz, which is very fast. The top display is a 7-inch 1080p 16:9 aspect ratio OLED display that goes up to 800 nits of brightness and up to a 165 Hz refresh rate. This is the same panel used in the AYANEO Pocket Evo, AYANEO Flip 1S, as well as the AYN Odin 2 Portal, so if you've used one of those devices, then you know that this is a great panel with very vibrant colors. Unlike the AYN Thor, which sports dual OLED displays, the bottom screen on the Pocket DS is LCD and is a 5-inch 4x3 1024x768 display. Now this might seem like a weird resolution, especially since the AYN Thor's bottom display is 1240x1080, but as we'll see later on in the video, this is excellent for Nintendo DS emulation. The Pocket DS has TMR sticks and Hall effect triggers, linear vibration motors, gyro support, and an 8000 mAh battery with support for fast charging. To wrap up the specs, we have a single USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port at 10 gigabits per second, a micro SD card slot running at 100 megabytes per second, Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3, and it's running Android 13. It's important to note that you do not need to buy the absolute fastest micro SD card, since the device itself will only read at 100 megabytes a second, so you can save some money by just getting a mid-tier SanDisk or Samsung card. I'll put some links to the ones I used in the description, including this 2 terabyte one. Now let's do our fake unboxing, where I put the device back into the box and we all pretend that I'm opening this up for the first time. The box itself looks pretty nice and has this origami outer layer that has the model info on the back. We can see here I got the retro gray color with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage. I bought this device with my own money from Indiegogo. AYANEO did not send this to me early or give me any special treatment, and all opinions are my own. If we take the wrapper off and pull off the lid, there's not much to the inside. The device is front and center inside this dense foam block, and underneath is a box with a USB cable. I've never used these cables since I like using the Anchor or Ugreen flexible or braided cables, but this one is thick and feels high quality. Otherwise that's it, we don't even get any recyclable info paper. I did buy the hard zipper case, which looks just like the one for the Flip 1S, just a little bit slimmer. It's a great case, very rigid, and should do a good job of protecting the device from bumps and falls. I got a few 5-inch screen protectors for the bottom screen, but AYANEO wasn't selling protectors for the top screen. I know people will say that you don't need screen protectors for a clamshell device, since when you close it the screens are protected, but I like that extra layer of security because accidents do happen. And if you're going to be playing a lot of DS games where you're interacting with the bottom screen, I think it's a good idea to use a screen protector. These didn't arrive in time for my AYN Thor review, but I do have the Nintendo Switch Japan Touch Stylus, which has a fiber tip, as well as the Mixu Stylus, which has both a fiber tip and a disc style tip, so I'll be using these throughout the video. Shoutouts to Russ from Retro Game Corner's recommendations for these two styluses. I'll leave his excellent video linked below where he tests a bunch of these styluses. I've been leaning towards the Nintendo Switch stylus because it's small and simple and the mesh fiber tip works well. The Mixu stylus works just as well, and you can move the cap to the other side to use the disc or mesh tip, and it even comes with replaceable tips, but it's just bigger and has more moving parts. There's nothing wrong with either choice, both work very well, it's all down to my personal preference and I choose the Nintendo Switch stylus, but I'm sure you'll be happy with either one. The controls on the Pocket DS are very similar to the Flip 1S. We have the same general layout with the left analog stick up top and D-pad on the bottom and ABXY buttons above the right analog stick and our other controls along the bottom edge of the device. They are using the same TMR stick modules as their other recent devices. These sticks are pretty good with no cardinal snapping, and we can see here on hardwaretester.com that the error rate is well under 1%, which is great to see. Visually, the stick caps look like the caps from their other devices from this year, such as the Pocket Ace, Pocket S2, and of course the Flip 1S DS. However, I have no idea why, but AYANEO decided to use a different kind of rubber material that is more slick and much less grippy. I can't say it any other way, I hate these stick caps, they are a huge step back in terms of usability. Clamshell devices like the Pocket DS or the AYN Thor have to make the analog sticks recess so the device can close, which means that most of the time your thumbs will be touching the top of the stick cap to move it around. So you need a very grippy material at least on the middle part so your thumbs don't slip off them, and that's not the case here. These are very annoying to use, and it feels like my thumbs are more gliding over the top of the stick and drifting it into position, instead of feel like I'm directly driving it in the direction I want. The AYN Thor stick caps have this similar issue, but at least they have this textured grip ring that engages as my thumb pushes the stick, so I do get some grip. I've actually been borrowing the caps from my Flip 1S during my testing, and I think I'm going to email AYANEO to buy a dedicated set of Flip 1S caps for this device. If you pick this device up, I would definitely recommend either doing the same or swapping them out for AYN or Retroid stick caps or ones off Etsy, and I would stay away from the stock caps. All of the buttons, including the D-pad, use dome switches. This makes all the controls very low profile, which is perfect for a clamshell handheld. The D-pad is what AYANEO calls a floating D-pad, which essentially means that the D-pad itself never touches the frame. Typically for other devices like the AYN Thor, the D-pad sits in these channels that prevent it from slipping or rotating and has a rim so it doesn't fall through the frame. Then the membrane is placed on top to give you that cushiony feel when pressing on those dome switches. The result is that if you were to flick the D-pad like this, it makes a clack sound, because when the membrane pushes the D-pad back up, the plastic rim hits the underside of the frame, causing that clacking sound. The D-pad on the Pocket DS is different in that the D-pad itself is glued to the rubber membrane, and the membrane is placed onto these slots on the frame. So the only noise that comes from the D-pad is from the dome switches themselves, which are very quiet at around 42 dB. Dome-based D-pads don't really have false diagonals, and if we run through my GBA test suite, we can see here that I'm getting no false diagonals whatsoever. The downside here is that this D-pad doesn't have a lot of pivot. If I press down in the middle, it doesn't necessarily bottom out per se, but I can feel it pressing a bunch of directions all at once, almost like I can press all 4 directions at once if I pressed hard enough. That being said, if we run through the rolling diagonal test, I can still roll some of these moves, but it definitely doesn't feel like I'm rolling much of anything. I'm just more consciously flexing the D-pad into these quarter and half circle movements, so while I think this D-pad is definitely good for D-pad-centric gaming and modern usage without concern of false inputs, I don't think this would necessarily be the most enjoyable fighting game experience. The ABXY buttons also use the same dome switches, but since these buttons have rims, they're just a little bit louder at around 44 decibels, but still very quiet. Personally, I think I prefer rubber membrane buttons because they feel more retro and feel like the handhelds and controllers I grew up with, but that's definitely a personal preference. These ABXY buttons are very quiet, not clacky, and work just fine, no issues with functionality. The one thing that does bother me about these is that somehow they seem to be rubbing against the shell because I noticed some white dust on the edges of the buttons. AYANEO almost always puts their start and select buttons on the bottom left, which I personally prefer. I figure most people would be used to having start and select somewhere up top and towards the middle like an Xbox controller, but this placement works just fine for me. It's so easy to use select as your RetroArch hotkey enable button, and I can quit a game by just smashing my thumb over both start and select. The bottom right has the AYANEO button and home button. The AYANEO button does something a little different on the Pocket DS than their other Android handhelds, and that's because it brings up a new Eye window overlay on the bottom screen, which I will go into extensively in the software section of the video. The home button can be reconfigured in settings, but the default behavior is to take you to the home screen, but even that behaves differently on this device. These use these golden dome switches, which are so quiet that they don't even register above the ambient noise level in my room. They are mushier than your standard dome switch, which is why AYANEO doesn't use them for every button. Along the bottom, we have the volume buttons and power button, which has a built-in fingerprint sensor. This fingerprint sensor works very well, and if I lock the device, I just need to hold my finger on it for a split second and it will turn the device on and unlock. It's very fast and very convenient. Next to that, we have a power status indicator light and the microphone. Now these last three buttons are the dual screen button, menu button, and turbo button. The dual screen button is supposed to let you do things like switch controller focus to the top or bottom screens. The menu button acts like a Steam, Xbox, or PlayStation button when you're doing things like game streaming, and the turbo button by default cycles through the various performance modes. I say supposed to because on my device, these buttons do not work at all. I thought it was a firmware issue, and I did see that there were some updates I needed to install when I first unboxed the device, including a controller firmware update. I installed those and recalibrated the controls, but they still didn't work. Long story short, I opened the device up and discovered that one of the ribbon cables that connects to the bottom board for these buttons had its connector completely sheared off. This ribbon cable is stuck to the underside of the battery, and my theory is that this cable must have already been under some tension before they stuck the battery to the frame, and when they installed it and screwed it together, it put enough force on the cable that it sheared the cable right off the connector. Only these three buttons are affected by this cable, everything else seems to work, and I'm not the only one to report this in the AYANEO Discord, so this might be a more widespread issue than AYANEO realizes. I did immediately reach out to AYANEO support when I first discovered the issue and sent them these pictures, and it took a few days, but they did respond that they would send me a new ribbon cable for free, but it's still in transit and I wasn't going to hold up this video any longer waiting for it. So we'll assume these buttons will work at some point, as I typically do use the guide button as my RetroArch hotkey, but for now I'm using select. Along the back of the device, we have the left and right shoulder buttons. These are a little louder than the D-pad and ABXY buttons at around 46 dB, but otherwise not too loud, there's just more plastic moving around. They're rounded and extend around to the sides, so they're easy to press from any position. Next to them are the left and right custom buttons, which are extra programmable buttons, and something I have really grown to appreciate having. By default, the LC button brings up the app switcher, and the RC button is your back button. The triggers are Hall sensing and are very comfortable to use. Here I'm streaming Forza Horizon 5 and Artemis, and I can feather the gas and keep the car in any RPM range I want without feeling like if I move my finger a bit that it's going to twitch into full throttle. The movement angle is just right as well, where it doesn't go straight up and down, but instead goes down but also inward a bit. If I move my hands up so my fingers are floating and imagine pulling a trigger, my finger also moves inward a bit, so these triggers are aligned with the natural movement of my fingers. This angle feels more correct for my finger movement than even the Flip 1S DS, which I also praised in my review. The Flip 1S's triggers move at a 45-degree angle, which is better than the straight down like the AYN Thor's triggers, but the 30-ish degree angle of the Pocket DS's triggers feel more close to how my finger moves and is also close to the Pocket Ace and Pocket S2's trigger angles. They do have a bit of a curve to them to try and prevent your fingers from slipping off them, but one criticism I have is I wish they would have used the same crosshatch texture that they used on the Pocket S2 shoulders and triggers. Those were excellent at grip retention. In terms of ergonomics, the Pocket DS weighs about 540 grams or about 1 pound 3 ounces. It's a hefty boy and you will definitely feel it, but I would guess that some of the weight comes from the large 7-inch screen and all-metal lid. Now my first impressions were a little spoiled by the Flip 1S DS, which shares a lot of similar design language as the Pocket DS, so I kind of knew what to expect when unboxing this, but in terms of first impressions, I think people will be surprised at how large this device is, compared to some of the offerings on the market like the AYN Thor. It's definitely hefty, but not so heavy that it's uncomfortable, just solid and feels high quality. The metal lid is anodized and feels just like a MacBook, and the plastic has this soft UV coating applied to it. People have complained that this coating is very fingerprinty, and you will likely notice it on the black model, but I personally like it and it makes the device feel super premium and also helps with grip retention. The Pocket DS has these ergonomic badonkadonks on the back, which help you grip it like a controller. I can spread my fingers out across the back and they will touch or intertwine a bit, but most of the time I'm holding this by the grip humps. The hinge is my favorite hinge on an emulation device, period. It's the same hinge design and basically the same lid and screen as the Flip 1S, and you can open it to almost any angle you want. The only fixed detents are at the fully closed and fully open positions. You can think of it like a MacBook hinge. It's tight but not too tight, and the mechanism is all metal, including the detents. What I like to do is open it all the way and back it to the point right before it snaps into the fully open position, and that's been the best angle for my usage. It lets me keep my wrist straight and the top screen at the right angle, so I'm not putting any strain on my tendons, an issue that I pointed out with the AYN Thor. If you didn't watch my review for the Flip 1S DS, I stress tested that hinge by fully opening and closing it over 1,000 times with no loss of functionality or tension. The only thing that developed on that hinge after my testing was a slight creakiness when closing it, but I figure that's just because it needs a little lubrication, otherwise it's been rock solid, so I have no concerns with the long-term durability of the Pocket DS's hinge. If you close the lid very slowly, when the lid closes you might hear a click, which might seem a little weird. The lid will close first, and then the detent for the closed position will click into place a split second later, which is more pronounced the slower you close the lid. Basically what's happening is the magnets that hold the lid closed catch the lid first and pull it shut, and then the detent clicks into place. But this is normal and nothing to be concerned about. The hinge is working as expected. Everything on the Pocket DS's frame is rounded with no sharp edges, which really helps with comfort. This is an analog-centric device, meaning the left analog stick is above the D-pad. I think this is the right choice given how powerful this device is, since it can emulate more modern systems like Switch and Steam games, and we're mostly limited by software compatibility. Playing games that mostly use the left stick, ABXY buttons, and maybe the shoulders and triggers will be the most comfortable, because you can keep a tight grip on the device and it feels natural to hold it like a controller. However, any other type of game, like D-pad-centric games or games that use the right stick a lot like first-person shooters, will require you to change your grip. You could try to maintain the controller grip and scrunch your thumb to reach the D-pad and right stick, but that's not comfortable. If I'm playing a game where I only need to use the bottom controls very infrequently, then I'll just slide my grip down a little bit and use the base of my thumb to hit the D-pad or right stick. Otherwise, I'll swing my hand outward a bit, and that lets me keep my thumb straight, which will be more comfortable for long gaming sessions. My other fingers will actually anchor themselves under the ergonomic grip humps, and sometimes I'll use my pinkies to support the device from underneath. The buttons are all easy to press since they're dome switches and are very responsive, so no issues with button fatigue over long sessions. My general criticisms about the control layout on the AYN Thor apply here as well, that you need to shift your grip to access the D-pad and right stick. Playing on a clamshell will always be a compromise between portability and ergonomics because there's just not that much space for the control layout given how large this bottom screen is. But I think the difference here versus the Thor are the ergonomic badonkadonks, which help a lot with comfort. I said in my Flip 1S DS review that I didn't mind this raised edge lip where the back shell seam is, and it wasn't really uncomfortable to me, but the Pocket DS completely avoids that issue by rounding the edge, and is just so much more comfortable and feels sleek. The one thing that I do think is a slight regression versus the Flip 1S is the balance point. On the Flip 1S, because there is more mass in the bottom half of the device, the balance point was right around here if you imagine a straight line going through the middle of the left analog stick and ABXY buttons. This meant that the device was biased to fall into your palms, and I was never concerned about the device wanting to fall forward. However, on the Pocket DS, the bottom half definitely feels lighter than the Flip 1S, so even though the balance point is in the same place on both devices, the Pocket DS feels ever so slightly top-heavy. I have not dropped this device or had it flip out of my hands or anything, so it hasn't been a real-world issue, but I did want to mention it in case that's something concerning to you. Also, I was playing Metroid Prime Hunters, where I was holding the device with my left hand and using the stylus to aim and transform into a ball and stuff, and after a while my arms started getting tired holding the device up. You probably won't be playing too many games where you need to hold this device up with only one hand, but that's something to be aware of. This device is definitely heavier in comparison to the Thor, and I never felt tired holding the Thor up. The last thing I'll say about ergonomics applies to clamshell devices in general, but having the main screen above your hands is better for your neck. If you're holding the device and looking down at the screen, you won't have to angle your neck as far down, which will reduce neck strain. For the screens, we have basically the exact same metal lid and 7-inch 1080p 16:9 aspect ratio display from the Flip 1S, and this panel is also used in the Pocket Evo and AYN Odin 2 Portal. It's a well-known panel at this point, has great color saturation, and gets very bright at 800 nits. This display goes up to 165Hz, which is great for game streaming. However, most of the time this will be running at 60Hz, and that's because there is an Android limitation that any external displays have to run at the same refresh rate as the main display. For the Pocket DS, the bottom display is the primary and the top display is the external, so you will need to turn off the bottom display if you want to increase the refresh rate. AYN has implemented what is basically a hack to get their top display running at 120Hz, which introduces some very distracting screen tearing on the bottom display. I believe AYANEO said that they would implement something similar, but I have not seen that update yet, so for now we're stuck with 60Hz on both displays. As I noted in my Thor review, I don't see this as a big deal for the majority of games you'll play on this device, especially emulation, since older consoles ran at 60Hz anyways. However, you will miss out on black frame insertion or BFI in RetroArch, where it runs the game at 120Hz and inserts a black frame between each real game frame to help smooth out motion blur. So if that's something important to you, the Pocket DS won't support that use case right now with both screens on. It will also affect you if you're game streaming via Artemis or running lightweight game hub games that can push those higher refresh rates and want to have a guide or something else on the bottom display. Hopefully AYANEO can implement something similar to what AYN did and let us access those faster refresh rates, but for now I'm evaluating the device as it is today, and we do lose out on some functionality compared to the Thor. Now the bottom display is new for AYANEO and is a 5-inch 1024x768 4:3 aspect ratio display that goes up to 550 nits, but the key difference here is that it's an LCD display and not a second OLED panel. When it was first announced that the Pocket DS was going to have OLED and LCD displays and not dual OLED like the Thor, a lot of people were concerned about light bleed. There were some pictures of DS units showing some pretty bad light bleed that were posted on Chinese social media, and people were canceling their orders left and right. I made an entire video talking about light bleed and how cell phone cameras make a little light bleed look so much worse than it actually is in person. I'll leave that link below. I think it's worth watching if you're worried about that. All LCD panels will have light bleed, it's just a byproduct of the panel design, and AYANEO themselves has said that this is a softer panel that is more susceptible to light bleed than other LCD panels, and they even went as far as to recommend people cancel their orders if they were concerned about the light bleed. For me and my device, I do notice some light bleed on my device, specifically along the bottom edge here. My camera settings will render the light bleed pretty close to how I see it with my own eyes. It is a little distracting when rendering dark screens, like if the game is loading or transitioning between levels, but once I'm in a game I completely forget about it. I think the reason why AYANEO chose this panel, knowing that it was a softer LCD panel that was more susceptible to light bleed, was because it's a large 4:3 display that happens to be a perfect 4x integer scale for Nintendo DS. We'll talk more about how Nintendo DS performs later on in the video, but in terms of how it looks, it cannot be understated how good DS games look on this device. Being able to completely fill out the 5-inch bottom display with perfect scaling is awesome, especially since I like to integer scale my retro games, even if it results in letterboxing on other devices. You can integer scale the top display as well, and have those chunky square pixels on both the top and bottom. Dual 5-inch images look really great on this device, and it's much bigger than the DSi XL, which has 4.2-inch screens, so this feels like the definitive Nintendo DS experience. No issues with top and bottom screen synchronization either. Here in Sonic Rush, I can see just a tiny bit of desync, but it's well within what I would say is acceptable and is not distracting to me. Nintendo DS is kind of an oddball resolution, so while 1024x768 is perfect scaling for that system, it doesn't have perfect scaling for any other retro system except a 6x integer scale for Pico 8, which is kind of random. You do get the benefit of a 4:3 aspect ratio, which will help with 3D-based consoles like PS1 and GameCube, but trying to integer scale 2D systems like SNES will result in letterboxing, where you have black bars on all sides, so I would probably just play those on the top screen. The speakers on the Pocket DS are front firing, which is nice to see compared to the bottom firing speakers on the Flip 1S. These speakers also get very loud, topping out at around 90 decibels during the heavy guitar parts of the Horizon Chase theme song. Here's a graph of the volume at the different levels, with the lowest audible volume at 46 dB, which is pretty quiet. To run through my usual audio tests, we'll listen to some dialogue from Trails in the Sky, but I'll use a different part of the intro this time to change it up a little.
You got that right! Are you okay, Dad? You're not hurt from fighting monsters?
Nope, I'm totally fine, see?
No issues hearing the voices here, it all sounds clear and not muffled to me. For Octopath Traveler 2's opening theme, we're listening for clear mids and highs with some bass from the drums. This audio isn't the greatest, everything sounds kind of tinny and the bass is muffled, but we do have an equalizer function, and using the settings from a Reddit post I found seems to improve the sound a lot. Take a listen. Everything sounds clearer, as if the previous audio was congested or something, and the bass is a little more booming, especially in person. In Hades 2, we can listen for the complex sound effects layering with the background music, starting with the stock EQ settings. Like before, everything sounds a little muffled, and the custom EQ fixes all of that. Okay, let's go over the software experience, because some things are different for the Pocket DS, but mostly just things that have been moved around and reorganized. After you set up your device, you'll be taken to AYANEO, which is their home launcher. We have a dock at the top, and then underneath are all your apps, and you can move these around or add and remove them to the dock. On the bottom screen, we have these tabs. The first screen is the dual screen tab, which lets us manage the two screens. We can turn on both or only one of the screens, so if you wanted to use the faster refresh rates of the top screen, you would choose the only home screen option and it would turn the bottom screen off. Then you can press the AYANEO button to bring up the I/O window, and at the bottom of the performance tab, we can increase the refresh rate up to 165 Hz. When running in a single screen, the I/O window is the same as their other devices, so the performance tab shows us metrics on our CPU and GPU, and we can change the performance mode and also the fan profile. The dual screen tab is new and has the same things from that bottom screen tab, so if I choose dual screen display, it will turn the bottom screen on again. The other option on the dual screen tab is the controller lock, and here we can lock the onboard controls to either the top or bottom screens, or have them automatically switch, which is the default. So if you're playing a game on the top screen with a guide on the bottom, you can lock the controls to the top screen so that when you scroll the guide with your finger, your controls stay focused on the game. Or you could be watching a movie on the top screen and playing a game on the bottom screen, so you would lock the controls to the bottom screen. Automatic switching basically uses the controls for the last display you tapped. So if I want to have my controls work for the top display, I just need to tap anywhere on the top display and I can move around, and the same with the bottom display. The application tab just shows a grid of all your apps and will launch the app on the bottom display. The tasks tab isn't really a tab, but just shows the task switcher and only seems to show apps that have been launched from the bottom screen. Finally, the control tab lets us control the volume, individual screen brightness, and also has widgets for things like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and taking screenshots. One thing I did notice that's a little annoying is that if you set the bottom screen brightness, turn the device on and turn it back on again, it will reset the brightness to maximum. AYN had a similar issue with their bottom screen and they quickly fixed it, so hopefully AYANEO can fix this as well. If we press the AYANEO button while both screens are on, the bottom screen will show the new I/O window overlay. This has mostly the same information as the performance tab from the single screen overlay, with our performance profiles, fan speed, CPU and GPU temps, and battery usage. The one thing that is definitely annoying to me is that I need to tap on every UI element twice to get it to do something. So for example, if I want to change the performance mode to gaming, I'll tap on it once and it kind of highlights it, and then I have to tap on it again to actually change to that profile. It's very annoying. I think this is AYANEO's way of implementing a focus system, because you can navigate through this overlay using the analog stick or D-pad, but I wish they would just let me tap on it once to focus and commit the action in one tap. We can swipe over to the next page on the overlay, and here we can configure various aspects of our controls, such as changing the ABXY layout and adjusting the analog stick, trigger, or vibration sensitivity. The last page has more widgets which can be useful, we just can't add, remove, or move them around. If we press the home button, the overlay dismisses and we're left with the blank screen. If you tap and hold on the blank area, right now this dialog is in Chinese, but the top option lets us change the wallpaper, and the bottom option restores this default wallpaper, so you can customize this device to look how you want. If we launch an app on one screen, we can push it to the other screen with a 3-finger swipe. Sometimes the window might reload, but otherwise it works well. When an app is running on the bottom screen, if we tap on the 3 dots button at the top, we can also push it to the home screen, minimize it, or close the app. Overall, I think the software features that AYANEO has implemented specifically for the Pocket DS are pretty good. There are definitely some bugs like the bottom screen brightness issue, and hopefully they fix those quickly. I would say it's not quite as good as what AYN has implemented, because we cannot do things like pin an app to always launch on a specific screen, control brightness for both screens at once, adjust volume for each screen independently, and we're still limited to 60 Hz on both displays unless we turn off the bottom display. Like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and the AYN Thor, the G3x Gen 2 is well known in the emulation community, having been used in several AYANEO devices like the Pocket Evo, Pocket Ace, and Pocket DMG. It is essentially an overclocked 8 Gen 2, so performance will be very similar if not slightly better than the AYN Thor. If we run the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme stress test, we get a best loop score of 4060 with a stability of 92%, which is within the expected range for this chip. Cooling is one of AYANEO's biggest weaknesses, and while the 92% stability might seem like a good number, technically the Pocket DS failed the stress test because you need a 97% or better stability rating to pass. I am planning on doing a teardown modding video so we can take a more in-depth look at the cooling system, so subscribe if you're interested in seeing that. I did one for the Flip 1S, and it was really interesting to see all the internal components, and I'm curious as to how similar it is with the Pocket DS. Thermals were a big issue on the Flip 1S, where running a game above around 22 to 25 watts would cause the device to thermal throttle. That being said, the Flip 1S is a PC handheld and the HX370 runs pretty hot, while the Pocket DS is running Android, and although the thermal design is similar, I haven't run into any thermal issues. Here in Trails of the Sky First Chapter running in Game Hub, which will typically max out CPU and GPU temps, we're staying consistent right around 70 degrees Celsius, and the fan isn't even going full blast, which is really nice to see. Speaking of the fan, it's generally pretty quiet without coil whine. At 100% fans, I do hear a little bit of whine, but I haven't had the device scale the fans up to max on its own, so the device stays pretty cool even under the most demanding gaming scenarios. Even when running the Wildlife Extreme stress test, CPU temps stayed around the low 70s and the GPU around the low 90s. I also never felt the device get hot to the touch, so I think that even though the thermal stability might not be perfect, overall the device performs well and I'm not concerned about the device getting uncomfortably hot like I was with the Flip 1S. In terms of gaming performance, like my AYN Thor review, I won't spend that much time on most of the typical systems I test like GBA, PS2, GameCube, and Switch. The G3x Gen 2 will power through these systems very well, and if you want a more detailed performance overview, I would check out my AYANEO Pocket Ace review, which has the same chip. The Pocket DS really shines with Nintendo DS emulation in particular because the bottom screen is a perfect 4x integer scale of that original 256 by 192 resolution. I've got the Sapphire Rhodonite fork of Melon DS, which adds dual screen support and has been specifically tested on the Pocket DS. If we go to Settings, Video, for dual screen presets, there are a few ways you can set this up. Unlike the Thor, the primary display for the Pocket DS is the bottom display, so if you want no hassle dual screen support for Melon DS and Azahar, you'll need to launch them from the bottom display, and you would choose the last dual screen preset, which is internal bottom, external top. I'll 3-finger swipe the app down to the bottom screen and then launch a game. I like to turn the integer scale option on, which won't change the bottom screen since it's already perfectly scaled, but the top screen will shrink a bit, and now we have two 5-inch images that are perfectly scaled. And because the top screen is OLED, the borders just disappear and this looks really good, and we have those perfect square pixels, and really is a great way to enjoy Nintendo DS games. The downside of this is that you have to remember to launch the game from the bottom screen. If you want to launch it from the top screen, only the top screen will display the game, but we can fix that. If we press the back button and change the dual screen preset to be internal top, external bottom, now we get the top screen displaying the top image, and to see the bottom image, we just need to hold down the AYANEO button for a second. I guess there's some weird quirk about how the bottom screen handles window management, because if we quit out of the game, you can see that on the bottom screen we're actually in ISpace. So yes, it's a little weird because now I have to tap on the bottom screen and press the home button to get out of ISpace. If we had the option to always launch Melon DS on the bottom screen, we wouldn't have this issue, so it's up to you which type of jank you want to deal with. Personally, I'm just always going to launch dual screen games from the bottom screen, and I'd rather not have to deal with getting in and out of ISpace. In terms of input lag, I also struggled to play through the same Rhythm Heaven minigame I tried on the AYN Thor. Here we can see that I'm still missing a lot because when I try to time my moves to the music, the timing of when the game recognizes my input is out of sync. However, one weird thing I found was that if I swap the dual screen preset so the bottom of the screen is on the top display, and now if I replay the minigame by flicking on the top display, I'm much more accurate and hardly ever missing. So I'm not sure what's going on, if it's just input lag from the bottom display, or maybe the top display has a faster input polling frequency because it can theoretically go up to 165 Hz refresh rate, and the bottom display only runs at 60 Hz, but this was the closest I could get to feeling like original hardware. Here on Elite Beat Agents, I'll show a side-by-side of me playing the same level using the bottom screen or the top screen, and we can see that I'm much more consistent in terms of accurate timing and hitting those 300 points when using the top screen versus the bottom. I did have a viewer comment on my AYN Thor review to change the audio latency setting to low instead of the default medium, and that did help a little bit, but the lag is still there. It's not a perfect fix, but I would still change this setting. For Nintendo 3DS, the experience is mostly the same in Azahara as with Melon DS. Go into settings and under layout, set the landscape screen layout setting to single screen, and then the secondary display screen layout to either the top or bottom screen, depending on if you want to always launch from the bottom screen or do the hold AYANEO button trick. I haven't played many 3DS games myself, but they seem to run well. You'll get some stuttering here and there while shaders compile, but otherwise it's nice to have such large screens to play these games. There will be some black bars on the left and right of the top image because the 3DS had a weird 10:3 aspect ratio, but they're minimal and the OLED display will make them mostly disappear. The Pocket DS has an 8000 mAh battery, which gives us really great battery life. It also charges very quickly. I was getting around 40 watts charging speed on my Anchor charging station. I ran my usual battery test at 50% brightness and 50% volume, and starting with the lightweight stuff and going up to the heavyweight PC emulation, we had Metroid Fusion for GBA, and in the Eco profile we're getting about 12.5 hours. For Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage on PS1, we get about 8 hours and 45 minutes. Advanced Wars Dual Strike for Nintendo DS, about 7 hours and 42 minutes. Golden Sun Dark Dawn is a little more graphically demanding, reducing our runtime a bit to about 7 hours and 9 minutes. For 3DS, Bravely Default Imbalance gets us around 4 hours and 45 minutes. Moving on to some more demanding Switch emulation, Metroid Prime Remastered Imbalance gets us about 5 hours and 15 minutes. God of War 2 on PS2, Balanced Profile gets us just under 3.5 hours. For Game Hub emulation, Celeste is pretty lightweight and we get about 7 hours and 42 minutes. Trails in the Sky first chapter in the max profile pushes this chip pretty hard and we get about 2 hours and 13 minutes running at about 40 FPS. And finally, I ran the Wildlife Extreme stress test from 100% until the battery died, which lasted about 1 hour and 25 minutes. Let's start wrapping up with my likes and dislikes of the AYANEO Pocket DS. My number one like about the Pocket DS is that it is the best Nintendo DS emulation experience you can get right now. With integer scaling, we have a perfect 4x integer scale that fills the 5-inch bottom display and takes up a large part of the top display as well. It's such a better experience than trying to show 2 images on one display and much sharper than original hardware. With the exception of the analog stick caps, the controls on the Pocket DS are excellent. Everything is very quiet and not clacky, especially the shoulder buttons compared to the super clicky ones on the Thor. AYANEO also got the trigger angle right on this, which is an improvement over where they started on the Flip 1S. It feels natural to pull and very comfortable. The ergonomics are also a big step above the competition. The grip humps really make it comfortable to hold for long gaming sessions without being too obtrusive. Like with the other clamshell devices on the market, you will need to shift your grip to reach the D-pad or right analog stick, but the grips make it so you still have a good hold on the device when doing so. However, of course I do have some dislikes, number one being quality control. I think we're starting to see the effects of AYANEO releasing so many devices at the same time. We have the Pocket DS and Conquer Pocket Fit shipping simultaneously, and pretty soon the Pocket Air Mini will start shipping as well. I'm still waiting for my AM01S Mini PC, which I've been told has been delayed, and there are still customers waiting for their Flip 1S units to ship. I think there is a flaw with how they are attaching the ribbon cable that connects the dual screen, menu, and turbo buttons, and I don't think I'm the only one who has had a hardware issue and probably has a broken cable without knowing it. I have come to expect some amount of jank when it comes to these emulation handhelds, regardless of the brand. Every company's device has some kind of jankiness to it. But most of the jank comes from the software side, where there are bugs or other weird issues that may or may never get fixed by software updates, but at least the hardware itself is functional. I think this scenario is completely unacceptable. To have a design flaw such that simply mounting a battery and assembling the device is likely breaking ribbon cable connectors. I hope that this issue is isolated to just a handful of units, but if you get your device and only these 3 buttons aren't working, you might have the same issue as me. AYANEO is sending me a new cable and I can do my own repairs because I'm comfortable opening these things up and tinkering, but for someone who maybe isn't as comfortable, they would have to go through the hassle of shipping it back to China and waiting for a repair to be shipped back, which could take several weeks, and that's not a great customer experience. This is the first time time I've had such an egregious quality control issue, and this is my 6th or 7th AYANEO device, and I'm wondering if this could be related to the fact that AYANEO might be spreading themselves out too thin with such a stacked release cycle these past several months, and I hope this doesn't become a recurring issue, especially as more Conquer Pocket Fits start shipping to customers. I am also not a fan of the analog stick caps. I do not understand why AYANEO would use such slick and slippery rubber or plastic for these caps. My thumbs easily slip off them and I feel like I have no control. I'm lucky that I had another device I could borrow caps from, but I think if you buy this device, the caps are the first things you should change. The input lag is a pretty big issue, and although the Thor has it too, and we can somewhat mitigate it with certain emulator settings, it's something I haven't had to mess with on other devices. I'm not sure if AYANEO can fix that with software, or if it's going to be something we're stuck with. Speaking of software, my final dislike is that while I usually praise AYANEO's software for their other devices, and I am a big fan of AYAWindow and all of its utilities as an overlay, I think their dual screen implementation is a little lacking compared to AYN. The AYN Thor has features like the ability to run the top display at a faster refresh rate, albeit with screen tearing on the bottom. I might have criticized the tearing in my review, but I would at least like to have the option, especially if we can possibly run this top display at the full 165Hz for game streaming. And the Thor can also control the volume for each screen independently, something that AYANEO definitely needs to implement for the Pocket DS. Overall, the Pocket DS has its strengths and weaknesses, but like the AYN Thor, it's also a device full of compromises. Clamshell devices in general inherently have compromises they need to make. By definition, the device needs to fold, so it's going to have a hinge that could crack and fail. If it has two screens, the bottom screen will make it difficult to arrange the controls so they're ergonomic for all games. Running two screens on Android seems to introduce a lot of input lag, which affects both the AYANEO Pocket DS and the AYN Thor. You have to know where you're getting into when choosing to buy one of these devices, but they can offer some really exciting benefits. So what do you think about the AYANEO Pocket DS? Let me know in the comments section below that like button. For me, this will definitely be my Nintendo DS device. I can't get over how good DS emulation looks on it. I didn't know these rhythm games like Rhythm Heaven or Elite Beat Agents existed before reviewing these dual screen devices, so they're not something that affects me that much personally. I'm much more of an RPG or strategy RPG kind of person, so I'll be playing through the Pokemon or Fire Emblem games, which will be perfect on this device. I did mention the AYN Thor a good bit in this video, but my next video will be a dedicated comparison video pitting these two against each other. That's all I have for you today. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching and have a great day.